Class, since we already have discussed the rules or the laws which are vulnerable to be violated to make a piece of evidence inadmissible, we are going to proceed to the rules of evidence under the rules of court. So there are several rules of evidence, namely best evidence rule, parole evidence rule, the rules on qualification of witnesses for a testimonial evidence to be admissible, and the rules on authentication of object evidence. Okay, so let's start with object evidence. Okay, so to better appreciate our lesson, let's go to our roadmap. So mo ni siya ang atong mapa kung asa ta padulong, kung asa po ta nagikan para kahibaw ta kung unsa na ang dagan sa ato ang discussion. So sa object evidence class, we will be starting with the introduction, meaning of object evidence. Part of that is the requisites of admissibility of object evidence, and object evidence and the right of self-incrimination. I think we already have discussed about the right against self-incrimination in relation to object evidence and documentary evidence. The third item is the categories of object evidence. This is especially important because in object evidence, we will be discussing more about authentication. So sa authentication class, lahi-lahi ang paagi kung lahi sa tag sa ka-category sa object evidence. Okay, so we'll discuss later kung unsa na sila. And lastly, the chain of custody. The chain of custody rule, also in relation the specific chain of custody in drug cases. Okay, so sa introduction class, we know that the rules on evidence do not declare which among the three major types of evidence is the most superior or has the most probative value. So walay mas labaw nila. The better view is to consider such types of evidence as complementing each other. So unsa may example nato ani class? The example of which is both documentary evidence and object evidence being offered as authentic before being admitted as evidence have to be identified and authenticated. So kaning DE or OE, while lahi-lahi ni sila upa maagi, lahi-lahi ni sila mga types of evidence, pero nagkinahanglan gihapon ni sila mo complement ra gihapon ang testimonial evidence because an object evidence or a documentary evidence to be authenticated, for it to be authenticated, must be identified and authenticate, to be admissible, rather, must be identified and authenticated first. So, you have to know that authentication class, the process of authentication and identification of evidence class need a natural person called a witness. When a witness is presented in court, his statements constitute testimonial evidence. So, sa akong ginakaingon ganina nga complementing ni sila sa each other because ang testimonial evidence class is needed for the authentication and identification of the object evidence and documentary evidence. Nga naman, ang kanini amang god nga object evidence o documentary evidence, dili man na sila makaistorya, dili na sila maka-identify themselves sa court date. Dili na sila makaingon nga, yes, Your Honor, ako to dito, Your Honor, ang napunit sa apprehending officer nga droga. Dili man sila makaistorya, dili po sila maka-identify. Mao nga nagkinahanglan sila og witness to sponsor the documentary evidence or object evidence. Okay, so ang inyo radyon tan-aw na ni class nga ang kanini tanan nga mga pieces of evidence class nag-complement ni sila sa each other. So, ang bottom line dyan sa atong discussion class is ang testimonial evidence makes the foundation of all the evidence. Nga namang mahimo mo siyang foundation tungod kay ang tanang evidence man good class must be authenticated and identified in court. Unya unsa man ang paagi sa pag-identify and pag-authenticate? Ang pag-identify sa witness who has personal knowledge actual and personal knowledge in gathering the evidence. So siya man ang mo-authenticate ana, siya pud ang mo-identify. Unya unsa man ang klase sa evidence ang pag-testify sa witness sa iyang pag-identify o authenticate. Mao ni siya ang testimonial evidence. So, mao nang nakaingon ko last time ninyo nga ang testimonial evidence is the foundation of all evidence. Okay? So, you already understand that. So, let's go class to the meaning of object evidence. Okay, so object evidence class is the real thing, like the knife used to slash the victim's throat, the bullet extracted from the victim's chest, the ring actually stolen, the blood splattered on the wall, so where the victim was found. So object evidence class does not refer to the perception of the witness, meaning dili ang katong pagdawat ug unsa ang nakita sa witness, dili na siya object evidence. Ang object evidence is the real thing itself. So dili na siya nag-mean nga recollection sa past events by a witness. Object evidence or real evidence is not a verbal description of something. It is the actual thing. So under the 2019 amendments class, objects as evidence are those addressed to the senses of the court. When an object is relevant to the fact and issue, it may be exhibited, examined, or viewed by the court. Okay, we already discussed the 5 senses of the court, like a human being. So not a sense of sight, sense of smell, sense of taste, sense of touch. So mo ni siya ang mga senses sa court. It is as if ang court naa atong 5 senses. So kung ang usa ka ebidensya, ang purpose nimo sa pagpresentar is para makita or ma-demonstrate dito sa korte, then it is an object evidence. So kung ang imong purpose sa usa ka ebidensya is para mahikap sa huwes, then it is an object evidence. Why? It is addressed to the senses of the court. Okay? So, we already discussed also about the O.J. Simpson case. Kahinumdum mo atong akong ginakaingon sa inyo nga sa O.J. Simpson naay nagather nga kanang baseball gloves nga naa didto sa ilahang locker. Unya ilahan ang gipresentar didto sa korte. Katutuang nga mao nga butang, object evidence to siya. Ngano man, kay mao man to siyang evidence nga gidemonstrate or gipakita, it is the real thing nga gihatag dito sa korte. Okay? So, object evidence is not visual alone. It covers the entire range of human senses, hearing, taste, smell, and touch. Okay, I'm sorry for that kay naay nang labay dire. Kadlaw na dire class, but I have to do this para sa inyo nga knowledge. I don't want you to proceed sa ato ang subject nga without understanding evidence. Okay, so we already understand the introduction. We already have tackled also the meaning of object evidence. Let's go to the requisites of admissibility of object evidence and an object evidence vis-a-vis the right against self-incrimination. Okay, so the requisites for the admissibility of object evidence are the following. The object evidence must be relevant, of course. Kabalik-balik ta ani, dapat relevant siya sa katong basic na to nga mga nahibaw-an nga relevant and competent. Okay, relevant meaning the object evidence must have a relationship to the fact in issue. Kung wala siya'y kalabutan or wala manggali siya'y connection sa fact in issue, then it is not relevant. Number 2, the object evidence must be competent. How do we know that the object evidence is competent? The object evidence is considered competent when the evidence is authenticated. Mao na nga niingon ko ninyo nga sa object evidence relevant kaayo nato ang discussion about authentication. So, next, the authentication must be made by a competent witness. Okay. So, ang authentication, di ba class, akong na-mention ganina, ang authentication is done by a witness because testimonial evidence serves as the foundation of all types of evidence. because dili maka-identify, inanimate. Unsa may pasabot anang inanimate? Dili makalihok, di makaistorya ang object or documentary evidence. Mao na nga kinahanglan niya ang usa ka witness to sponsor ana nga ebidensya para mo identify and mo authenticate ana niya. Ngano man kay sa object evidence mangod class, it has to be established in court nga it is the same thing nga nagather dito sa crime scene. For example, ang ang napresentar dita kintahay dito sa korte is 15 na kakilo nga shabu. Unya ang nagather lang dito sa crime scene is 5 kilos lang nga shabu. So, makita nimo ang diferensya, dili na siya, wala na ninyo ma-preserve ang integrity ug identity sa maong ebidensya because it is not anymore the same thing as that gathered dito sa crime scene. So supposedly, para mahimo siyang admissible, dapat ninyo i-establish nga ang katong nakuha nga shabu nga 5 kilos mao jud na ang the same shabu nga mapresentar dito sa korte. Mao na siya ang purpose sa authentication. So, para ma-identify nga mao jud na ang katong nakuha dito sa crime scene. Wala alisdi, wala matamper, wala siya makaning kuan mahilabti, or wala siya maadto sa usa ka tawo nga wala in the possession sa usa ka tawo nga wala untay labot ana. Okay? So, ang authentication class must be made by a witness. Competent witness. Unsa may pasabot og competent witness? Ang competent witness class is someone who has actual and personal knowledge. So kung ikaw, Mr. A, nakadungog ra ka aning istorya-istorya dito sa imuhang kauban nga pulis, dili ikaw ang competent witness. Nga naman, kay dili man ikaw mismo ang nay actual and personal knowledge ana. So who is the competent witness? For example, the apprehending officer or the investigating officer nga assigned to that case. Kay siya man mismo ang nakakuha sa maong mismong ebidensya. Okay? So, the object evidence must be formally offered in evidence. Ang formal offer of evidence class, we will learn that later. So, ang pasabot ra jud ang formal offer class after identifying and after establishing the identity and the authentication sa mao nga ebidensya in court, imo na siyang i-offer in evidence. Kay the court will not consider evidence, a piece of evidence nga not formally offered. Dapat jud siya i-offer. Okay? So, let's go to the meaning of each. So, kuan naman na nato siya, na-discuss naman nato ganina, no? Na to be relevant, the evidence must have a relationship to the fact and issue. The object evidence must be competent, the evidence must be authenticated. For the object not to be excluded by the rules, usay pasabot ang competent, meaning dapat authorized siya by the law and authorized by the rules. So for the object not to be excluded by the rules, the same must pass the test of authentication. So unsa man ning test of authentication? The test of authentication class is, nagpasabot ra siya nga, is it the real thing? Or is it the actual object it is claimed to be? So again, for example, sa gun used in murder, if the prosecution wants the admission of the gun used in the murder, it must prove that it is the very same gun used by the accused. So another gun, although identical siya with the actual gun in all respects, would not satisfy the requirements of authentication. Okay? So, to authenticate the object, there must be someone who should identify the object to be the actual thing involved in the litigation. This someone is the witness. So, testimonial evidence provides the foundation of all types of evidence. I mentioned that already. The authentication must be made by a competent witness. To authenticate the object, the witness must have capacity to identify the object as the very thing involved in the litigation. So, what do you mean by capacity to identify? He must have actual and personal knowledge of the exhibit he is presenting for admission. This is because a witness can only testify to those facts which he knows of his personal knowledge, that is, which are derived derived from his own perception. That is Rule 130, Section 36. The object must be formally offered in evidence. A formal offer of evidence, particularly is a vital act before the admission of evidence, because the court shall consider no evidence which has not been formally offered. That's Rule 132, Section 34. So you see the interplay of the rules of evidence. So mo na siya ang magic sa evidence class. You will learn it if you know, or you learn evidence by bird's eye view. So dapat makakita ka sa mapa, kay dili na siya ma-learn nga sunod ang mao nga rules. Okay, so let's go to authentication, test of authentication. Mubalik hapon ta sa test of authentication. So according to Dean Riano, kani si Dean Riano, mao ni siya ang kaning known dyan siya nga author sa libro sa Rules of Court. So according to Dean Riano, even an ancient document requires a witness to testify on the characteristics of the document, even if it no longer requires authentication. So unsa man ning ancient document class? Under under Section 20 of Rule 134 of the Rules of Evidence, ang ancient document class means kadto bitaw mga documents nga more than 30 years old, kani Section 21, which is produced from a custody in which it would naturally be found, if genuine, is unblemished by any alteration or circumstances of suspicion. No other evidence of its authenticity need be given. So unsa may pasabot ani niya? Kanini ang ancient document class sa rules on authentication under Rule 134, makita na ninyo dito, dili na jud unta na kinahanglan siya authentication. However, even that nga wala na magkinahanglan og authentication class, nagkinahanglan jud gihapon siya og witness to testify on the characteristic of the document. Ngano man imong i-establish nga ang document class is ancient, inyong i-establish nga more than 30 years old, ang iyang porma palang daan o iyang baho palang daan. So again, it is related to the kanang topic I mentioned a while ago, nga ang foundation lagi sa tanang types of evidence is ang testimonial evidence. Kaya magkinahanglan jud ang tanang type sa ebidensya og witness to sponsor it or to testify or to identify it. So ang ancient document class, again, if you are asked during the exam, ancient document does not require authentication anymore. However, it still needs a witness not to authenticate but to testify on the characteristics of the document. Okay? So, okay, let's go to the object evidence versus the right against self-incrimination. So, we already mentioned that the right against self-incrimination cannot be invoked against object evidence. Nga naman class, because there is no testimonial compulsion. Wala may gipugos nga gipa mo testify siya sa against sa iyang kaugalingon. Ako na ning ginabalik-balik sa una pa class. Kailangan pa bang i-repeat yan? Sus, Ginoo ko, nakasabot na mo ani. Okay. So let's go to the categories of object evidence. Unsa man ni mga categories of object evidence? This is especially relevant or important class because it differs sa paagi sa pag-authenticate sa mao nga object evidence. So kung lahi nga type sa object evidence, lahi pud ang paagi sa iyang authentication. So the common problem sa ato ang kaning object evidence class, kung mapresentar na ta dito sa korte, lies in the showing that the object sought to be admitted is in fact the real thing and not a mere substitute or representation of the real thing. So this problem of authentication is commonly called laying the foundation for the evidence. Okay? So for the purpose of authentication, again, take note, for the purpose of authentication, an object evidence, or for laying the foundation for the exhibit, object evidence may be classified into the following: unique objects made unique, non-unique objects. Okay, so sa non-unique objects, You have to relate that to the chain of custody rule. So, familiar man siyang chain of custody rule ninyo. Okay, so let's go to let's go to unique objects class. What do you mean by unique objects? Ang kaning unique objects class, mao ni siya ang katutuang naay mga unique characteristics. Unsa man na ay readily identifiable marks. Take note, objects that have readily identifiable marks. Unsa may example ana? Serial number sa caliber 45 pistol. Caliber, my God, sorry for my British accent class. Okay. Caliber 45 pistol. So, naman ay mga serial number. So, that is a readily identifiable mark. Dili na ma-change kay kada pistola or pusil, lahi-lahi na siya og serial number. Okay? Kung legal ang paggagama sa pusil. Number 2, unsa maning objects made unique? These are objects class that are made readily identifiable. So, dili siya readily identifiable, but you are able to make it readily identifiable. Meaning, naa kay mabuhat para mahimo siyang unique or magamaan nimo siyang mark to make the object identifiable. So, may example ani. Kaning kitchen knife, typical kitchen knife. Kaning kitchen knife nga imong mapalit din sa merkado, nabili na yung serial number. Wala. Pareho ra nag kitchen knife, tanan ang naa din ha. However, you can always do something para imo siyang mahatagan og markings to identify or maghimo kag markings para ang kaning mao nga pistola mahimong unique nga ma-identify siya nga mao jud ni siya ang napunit nimo didto sa crime scene. For example, kung kintahay si Mr. A naka-gather og evidence sa crime scene, murder ni siya nga nahitabo pagluba-luba. Unya ang pagpunit niya dito sa crime scene, nakita niya ang katong pag-investigate niya, nakita niya ang katong kitchen knife nga gigamit sa pagluba, nabulit siya sa dugo. So, ang kitchen knife, since it is considered an object that can be made unique, pwede na niya nga butangag marking. O saan man niya pagbutang og marking, pwede man niya i-engrave. Mga kita siya dito og hait nga kuan, pwede na niya silsilan or iyahang engrave ang iyahang initial para naa na siya timailhan. Mo na siya class ang sakto nga pagkaistorya. Naa na siya timailhan nga before nimo siya isulod sa sealed nga container para i-present na dito sa korte or iaadto na dito siya sa kanang forensics or sa inyuhang investigating kanang team, unya ipresentar na dito sa korte, at least ini-testify nimo, moingon na ka dito nga, yes, ako to your honor ang nagkuha, apprehending officer, ako to ang nagkuha sa maong ebidensya. Unya inig-testify nimo, yes your honor, nakakuha kog knife, ang knife mo gigamit sa pagluba sa mga biktima. I-show na kita sa imuhang knife, showing you this knife. Is this the same, can you please identify this knife? Maingon man jud na sa korte. Yes your honor. So unsa man ni siyang imuhang nakit-an nga kutsilyo? Is this the same knife nga imuhang nakit-an dito sa imong nagather sa crime scene? Yes your honor. Nganong makaingon man ka nga this is the same knife nga imuhang nakuha dito sa crime scene? Because your honor, I'm very sure nga naghimo ko og marking dito, gi-engrave na ko ang ako ang initial nga MRM sa mao nga knife. So kuhaon na dayon tong knife, pangitaon na dayon to kung naa ba joy initial nga MRM. So ipakita nimo kintahay kay ikaw man ning testify. Okay, is this the same knife nga imong gi-engravean o kanang MRM? Yes your honor, mao ni siya ang akong gi-engrave, imo mapakita. So kana naa siya naghatag na kag timailhan nga mao jud to ang the same thing nga gigamit sa pagpatay. Ngano man kay ang mao nga knife is an object that can be made unique. Kay pwede man siya ma-made readily identifiable. Okay? So nasabtan class ha, unsa man po ning non-unique objects. Kaning non-unique objects class wala jud ni sa duha. Meaning wala siya identifiable marks, walay serial number, or dili pud siya pwede nga ma-readily identifiable, meaning wala kay mabuhat para mahimo siyang unique or may readily identifiable siya. Unsa may example? Drops of blood o kana semen or kaning fiber, mga grains o kana naa siya, imo day nang mamarkan ang syabo sa imong initial. Dili nganuman kay tungod sa iyang kagagmay, dili wala jud kay mabuhat ang dugo, imo day na siya mabutang agtimailhan nga imuhang pirma. Dili nganuman kay dili jud pwede, dili siya by nature, dili wala jud tay mabuhat, we cannot do anything about that. So mao na siya nga sa authentication mas lisod jud ang non-unique objects nganuman kay dili man nimo siya mahatag og timailhan nga mao jud na the same thing nga imong na-capture or na-seize dito sa crime scene. Do you understand? So, mao na nga, we relate that to the chain of custody rule. The chain of custody rule is the rule nga ato ang is the process na atong ginagamit para ma-identify nato and ma-authenticate nato ang non-unique objects. So much so nga mahimo siyang admissible in court. Kay again, part sa mga requisites for admissibility of object evidence is number 1, it must be relevant. Number 2, it must be competent. And how is it? How does the object evidence? How do we place the object evidence in the level of kaning admissible? Isa dito sa part nga admissible na siya. So unsa pa itong buhaton? Atong i-authenticate na ay test of authentication. Unya unsa man ang test of authentication, inyong i-identify nga it is the same thing nga nagather dito sa crime scene. So ang chain of custody rule mao na siya ang mo-cure ana sa kalisod sa pag-identify and pag-authenticate sa non-unique objects. Okay? So let's go to the chain of custody rule. So, unsa man ang chain of custody rule? The chain of custody is established by the testimony about about every link in the chain. So, link, lahi-lahi nga link in a chain from the moment the item was picked up to the time it is offered in evidence in such a way that every person who touched the exhibit would be able to describe how and from whom it was received, where it was and what happened to it while in the witness's possession, the condition it was received, and the condition in which it was delivered to the next link in the chain. So gathering from this definition class, ang kaning link nga inyohang hisgutan class, ang link class nagpasabot na sa mga tao nga nakagunit sa mao nga non-unique object. Every person who touched the exhibit. So, ang tanang person who touched the exhibit, mao na siya ang link. And kada usa nila dapat ipresentar siya dito sa korte para iyaha nga i-describe niya how and from whom it was received, where it was and what happened to it while naa sa iyang possession, ang condition